lonely rancher, bought a girl labeled deaf and dumb. But she knew every word he said. Montana, 1883. The autumn sun scorched the weathered boards of the frontier town where horses whinnied and men haggled with tobacco-stained breath. The season's final livestock auction was drawing to a close, but a crowd still gathered near the stock pen where a chestnut mare stood shaking, ribs visible beneath her coat, flanks marked with old wounds. Jacob Thornton adjusted his worn hat against the harsh light, quiet as always. At 37, he was a man carved by solitude and prairie winds. He seldom ventured to town except for necessities or livestock. He'd noticed the mare at dawn and returned now as the crowds thinned. His boots echoed on the packed earth as he approached. That's when he saw her. A young woman, perhaps 20, stood behind the pen. Her auburn hair clung to her face, dress frayed at the edges, bare feet caked with dirt. She neither spoke nor wept. Her green eyes drifted, following invisible paths. Beside her stood a man clutching a bottle and a rope, the rope bound not to the horse, but to her wrist. "Got a mute one here," the drunk bellowed. "Came from my late wife. Girl don't talk, don't hear, but she works hard, cooks decent, real bargain." Several men snickered cruelly. One spat tobacco juice. Jacob started to leave. He'd come for a horse, nothing more. Then he felt it. Not a sound, not a plea, just her gaze. The woman watched him without desperation, without begging. Just a clear, steady look that held something he hadn't encountered in years. Recognition, perhaps a reflection of his own isolation. The drunk stumbled forward. "You got money? Want the horse? Girl comes free. I ain't hauling her back." Jacob paused. The mare snorted nervously. The woman's eyes never left his face. He turned back, meeting the drunk's bloodshot stare. "I'll take them both." Crude laughter erupted. "Starting a collection, Thornton?" Someone jeered. Jacob didn't respond. He counted coins into the man's palm. Enough for the horse, nothing more. The drunk shoved the rope at him, but the woman instinctively stepped behind Jacob. "She's yours," the drunk slurred. "Don't say I didn't warn you. She ain't worth the grain." Jacob untied the rope and tossed it aside. He led the mare from the pen, the woman following with careful steps. She carried nothing but a threadbare shawl. At his wagon, she stopped, waiting. He gestured to the back. She climbed in, folding into the corner like someone accustomed to being overlooked. As he took the driver's seat, he felt the lightest touch on his jacket. Looking down, he saw her fingers had brushed his sleeve once. She wasn't looking at him now, her attention on the distant mountains. But in that brief contact, he understood. She hadn't thanked him or pleaded, but she'd chosen to trust him. Jacob Thornton, who conversed more with horses than humans, who dwelt alone on 300 acres of Montana soil with only fences for companions, and now a woman who couldn't hear, who perhaps understood more than anyone had ever realized. He flicked the reins. The wagon rolled forward into the dusty road. Behind him, she sat wrapped in a blanket, face turned to the breeze. Neither looked back. The wagon wound through twilight and dust, threading between scattered pines and rolling hills until the landscape opened into Montana's vast emptiness. Jacob's ranch wasn't impressive. A log cabin with a sagging porch, several outbuildings, and endless grassland where cattle roamed beneath infinite sky. But it was peaceful, orderly, and for a man like him, it had always sufficed. Until now. He helped her down from the wagon, uncertain if she'd run or remain frozen. She stepped down gracefully, her eyes surveying the land not with fear, but with careful observation, as if memorizing every detail. In the kitchen, Jacob lit the stove and gestured to the kettle. She nodded and approached without hesitation, locating cups and ladles like someone who'd always belonged near hearth and hunger. Still, she made no sound. After dinner, he retrieved chalk from a drawer and tapped the doorframe. "Name," he said slowly. She studied him for a long moment, then knelt by the frame. With deliberate strokes, she wrote in flowing letters, "Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated aloud, testing how it felt. She gave no smile, but rose and walked toward the barn. The following dawn, Jacob discovered her in the stable beside the injured mare. The horse had barely eaten since auction, its hind leg inflamed from old injury. Sarah ran a wet cloth along the mare's side, communicating with her hands. Not signs, just the patient rhythm of someone who listened through touch. Jacob watched from the doorway. He'd seen experienced hands kicked for less, but the mare remained calm, trembling only slightly as Sarah wrapped its leg with practiced care. Perhaps she couldn't hear, but she certainly understood. That day, Jacob assigned her tasks: scrub floors, heat water, organize the tack room. She completed them without complaint or questions, without sound. Each evening he left chalk, and she'd write brief notes. Feed running low. Dog favoring left paw. Storm coming. They never conversed, but the silence felt companionable. Until the tempest arrived. It began like most Montana storms, deceptively mild. A warm wind stirred at sunset, rustling the grass like a whispered warning. Jacob noticed storm clouds massing on the horizon, but thought little of it. He was in the cattle barn when she appeared. Sarah, barefoot and breathless but silent. She seized his sleeve urgently. "What?" he asked, startled. She pointed skyward, hands shaking, eyes conveying what her voice couldn't: danger. He hesitated, halfway through examining a sick calf, but something in her expression compelled him to move. She pulled again, toward the door, away from the yard. Then it struck. Lightning split the sky, hitting the massive pine behind the barn. The explosion shook the ground. Sparks erupted, the tree blazed and toppled with a groan like the earth mourning. Jacob staggered backward. The calves bellowed in panic. Smoke spiraled upward. He stared at her. Sarah stood motionless outside the entrance, her face illuminated by flames, eyes calm, breathing rapid. She had known, not guessed, not sensed, randomly. When the wind shifted, she had known before thunder, before the atmosphere changed. Jacob approached, slowly, still stunned. "How did you—" But she only watched him, silent and certain. That night, after extinguishing the fire and settling the animals, he sat with her at the table. No chalk, no words, just a man with weathered hands on worn wood, and a woman who couldn't speak yet somehow had heard something beyond anyone else's perception. For the first time in many years, Jacob realized he wasn't alone. He looked at her hands resting in her lap. "Sarah," he said softly. She raised her eyes to his. Silence responded, and it was enough. Since the storm, Jacob had begun observing more carefully, not with distrust, but with the measured interest of someone who'd lived in solitude too long and now encountered something inexplicable, yet didn't wish to question it. Sarah never spoke, never used formal signs, rarely wrote beyond basics. She had no education, no language, and yet she seemed to comprehend more than anyone he'd known. When the lead cow stood isolated in the field, not grazing, Jacob attributed it to weather. He made a mental note to monitor her, but Sarah moved decisively. She brought hay to the birthing pen, drew water infused with wild herbs, and stood by the cow, stroking her sides in measured patterns. By nightfall, the cow was delivering. Somehow she'd known. Jacob said nothing, but watched her closely. Sleep eluded him. The next day brought new weight. He returned from town with tense shoulders, bearing the burden of old grievances. The sheriff had spoken in veiled threats about land rights, rumors that his father had claimed more than his due after the Civil War. Violence, displacement, guilt. None of it was fresh, but the sting persisted. He mentioned nothing to Sarah, but when he sat on the steps gazing into the fading light, she came and stood nearby. She didn't speak, simply rested her hand on his shoulder, light as air, solid as stone. After a prolonged silence, Jacob murmured, "How do you sense that I carry shame about this land? About what my father did to secure it?" Sarah's dark eyes searched his. Then she slowly placed her hand over his heart. Afterward, she turned and walked to the ancient cottonwood where his father's marker stood, weathered beneath Montana sky. She'd never read the inscription, never inquired, yet she knew. That night, Jacob thrashed through dreams of artillery and burning fields. His father's voice emerged from smoke, gruff and proud. "I gave you land, boy, and I gave you the blood that bought it." He woke, gasping, breath harsh in the stillness. Then he saw her. Sarah sat near the fireplace. She'd lit a solitary candle. In the wavering light, her silhouette appeared etched from darkness and dignity. Beside the candle lay a faded blue kerchief, edged with delicate embroidery, his mother's. Jacob hadn't seen it in 12 years. It had been stored in a locked trunk no one else accessed. He sat upright. "How?" Sarah didn't look at him. She stood wordlessly and moved to the exit. No explanation was needed. She'd sensed something beyond hearing, not words or memories, but anguish, sorrow, the muffled burden of remorse wedged between bones, the hushed sound of a man's spirit fracturing when pride forbade acknowledgment. And through her quietness, she responded. She heard. For the first time, Jacob feared, not for his property, heritage, or even conscience. He feared losing the sole person who recognized his emotions before he voiced them. Each morning, Sarah wrote on the slate beside the stove, "Today brings promise." I sense it. Sometimes she erred, but usually she was right. As weeks passed, Jacob found himself believing, too. They developed rhythms without words. She'd touch his wrist before rain. He'd leave mint tea by her bedside when she couldn't rest. When his hands cramped from mending fence wire, she'd massage them with liniment, never asking about the scars cross-hatching his palms. When her feet bled from walking the rocky paths barefoot, he'd wash them in the basin, never questioning why she refused boots. Understanding lived in the spaces between their silences. The first murmur came from the miller's wife. "She watches the livestock too intently," she said, kneading dough on her porch, voice hushed but sharp as broken glass, like she knows which will sicken next. Within days, the minister's son added fuel. "She touched our milk cow and it birthed too early. That ain't natural." No one had heard Sarah speak, and the less she offered, the more the town seemed determined to fill her silence with dread. At the mercantile, mothers drew their children close when she passed, though she only came for cornmeal. At the postal office, someone spat near her boots. Most times she kept her gaze lowered, never reacting. But Jacob noticed how her fingers whitened around the supply basket, how her footfalls grew softer, as if attempting to vanish from earth that refused to release her. He didn't address it with her, and she never questioned why the world couldn't tolerate wordless compassion. But when a ranch hand's daughter fell ill with raging fever, flushed and convulsing, it wasn't the physician they summoned. It was Sarah. She entered the workers' cabin silently. She didn't request consent, simply knelt by the child's cot, placed a palm on her chest, then forehead, and closed her eyes. When she opened them, she walked outside, selected 3 plants from Jacob's drying rack, sage, willow bark, and prairie tea, and returned with steaming compress. The girl drank the brew without protest. By dawn, she sat up, requesting food. Her mother sobbed, clutching Sarah's hands in gratitude. But the following afternoon, she could be heard gossiping at the well. She never asked the symptoms. How did she know? The fear was no longer whispered. 3 days later, they arrived with lanterns, unlit, but held like threats. 10 townspeople, boots stirring dust, gathered at Jacob's gate. The eldest, Harrison, whose own family hadn't visited in years, stepped ahead. "We want her gone. That girl perceives things she shouldn't." Jacob stood in the barn entrance, arms crossed. He hadn't shaved recently, and his expression was hard as iron. "She's mute." "That ain't the same as deaf," Harrison barked. "She predicts weather before clouds form. She communes with beasts like they answer. My prize bull died last week. She's the only one who'd been near. You think she hexed it? I think she's hexed entirely." Agreement rippled through the assembly. Inside, Sarah stood behind the curtain. She'd felt the gravel crunch beneath their boots, seen their faces twisted, not with hatred, but something worse, conviction. She moved to open the door, but Jacob raised his hand. He stepped forward, boots sinking into mud, and faced them directly. "She saved a child." "Maybe she caused the fever first," a woman hissed. Jacob didn't raise his voice, but it carried weight. "She's the only soul I know who truly listens, not with ears, with her hands, her breath, her entire being." The crowd stilled. "I've lived 37 years, he continued, voice steady, "and I can count on one hand those who genuinely heard me. Not just words, but silences, my regrets, my grief. She did that without uttering a sound." He turned slightly, gaze sweeping across them. "You want to drive someone out for being different? For seeing what you're too frightened to acknowledge? Fine, but you'll go through me." Harrison opened his mouth, then shut it. No one moved. Slowly the group dispersed, lanterns unused, steps heavy. That night the ranch lay silent except for wind. Inside, Sarah set cider to warm, then sat beside Jacob at the table. She didn't sign, didn't write, didn't even meet his eyes, but after a moment she reached out, resting her fingers on his hand. It wasn't gratitude, it was recognition. December's first snow fell quietly, like a quilt laid over all that had fractured or scarred. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, fingers guiding a needle through fabric scraps, leather pieces, wool remnants, lining from Jacob's old jacket. She was crafting a coat, not for herself, but for him. She didn't need to hear wind to know cold was approaching. Jacob observed from the doorway. She worked with intention, each movement purposeful. She had no spoken language, but in the months since the townspeople had retreated and he'd chosen to keep her, his world had found harmony again. She prepared coffee before dawn touched the mountains. She scattered pine needles in the henhouse. She groomed horses in patient circles and trained young colts, using motions no wrangler had considered. He'd never witnessed animals respond so readily. She'd stand motionless until a nervous foal approached, then raise one hand gradually, palm open, and wait. Somehow, invariably, they understood. The quiet surrounding the ranch no longer felt like isolation. It felt like awareness. One late afternoon, Jacob rode toward the north boundary, inspecting fences before the approaching storm. Dusk was settling when his horse spooked, perhaps a loose stone or unknown scent, and reared. He fell hard, shoulder striking frozen ground. Air rushed from his lungs. For moments, only throbbing pain registered where his arm hit an exposed root. He struggled upright, blood seeping from his elbow. Darkness deepened rapidly. He wrapped cloth around the wound and attempted walking, but each step sent sharp pain through his side. When he staggered into the yard, last light had vanished. Sarah burst from the cabin before he could call. She'd sensed it, or simply known, one of those unexplainable intuitions that defined her. She supported him inside, seated him by the fire, and carefully removed the bandage. Her brow creased as she worked. She brought water, cleaned the gash, and applied a poultice of yarrow and pine resin. He watched her work. "You always know," he whispered. She met his gaze. Then, unexpectedly, she lifted his hand to her cheek and pressed her lips gently against the wound's edge. Jacob froze. The fire crackled. The room seemed to pause, holding its breath. Sarah didn't speak or smile, but something transferred between them, like a passage opening in the stillness. Later, as snow began and frost decorated the windows, Jacob sat across from her. He'd taken paper from his desk and written slowly, deliberately, each letter shaped with intention. "I want to hear your heart, if you'll let me listen with mine." She studied the words extensively, then her fingers traced them individually, as if sensing truth within the ink. When she finally looked up, her eyes glistened, not from sadness. She reached across and touched his chest once, briefly. Then, for the first time since entering his life, she smiled. Not politely, not from fear or obligation, but like dawn breaking, like something releasing after long confinement. Outside, wind howled. Inside that cabin, a silence deeper than language had discovered its voice. And it was warm, and it was real. They began teaching each other. Sarah showed him signs: water, fire, thank you, sorry, tomorrow. Her fingers moved like grass in wind. Though he struggled, she never mocked, only guided his hands until he succeeded. Jacob taught her riding. She'd never used a saddle. Initially, she gripped the horn desperately, but he walked alongside, speaking softly, though she couldn't hear. She moved with the horse regardless, feeling its rhythm through her body. Together, they weathered winter. Together, they found a language that needed no sound. The seasons softened, winter's grip loosening on the ridges. Between storms, life resumed, and with it, something else. Something measured and constant between Jacob and Sarah. The town's whispers had faded to occasional glances, neither hostile nor welcoming, but no longer edged with fear. People had seen too much. A child saved, a storm predicted, a woman who heard with her palms and healed with herbs their grandmothers might have known. The first to return was Ben Cooper, a hired hand with a separated shoulder. The doctor was traveling east, and no one else understood proper binding. He appeared one gray morning, reins in his good hand, the other hanging uselessly. Jacob saw him from the porch. "What brings you, Ben?" Ben nodded toward where Sarah knelt in her herb garden. Heard she mends things, quietly. Jacob gave a careful nod. "She does." Sarah approached without words. She examined the shoulder, her hands confident, her expression focused. She moved, as if listening to something beneath skin and sinew. When she found the right position, Ben flinched, then exhaled deeply. 2 days hence, a widow arrived. She hadn't slept peacefully in months. Sarah sat with her through dusk, hands lightly on her shoulders, until the trembling ceased. The next dawn, the woman returned bearing fresh bread and a knitted shawl. "For the young woman," she said, "the one who hears deeper than most." That season passed with fewer harsh words, fewer names spoken in fear. Jacob and Sarah continued as before, quietly, but now travelers nodded when passing. Some left preserves at the gate. Each morning Sarah wrote on their kitchen slate, "Today holds goodness. I feel it." Sometimes she was mistaken, but mostly she proved right, and gradually people trusted. Then came the Sunday that transformed everything. Frost had barely lifted when the church bell tolled urgently. Before its echo faded, panic erupted. An 8-year-old boy had disappeared during morning chores. One small boot was discovered near the forest edge. Nothing more. Men shouted orders. Women prayed. Dogs barked frantically. When Jacob and Sarah learned, he grabbed his coat. Sarah, already beside him, touched his arm, then knelt. She pressed her palms flat against the earth. Hands, wrists, forearms. Then she crawled forward, pausing at subtle signs, a disturbed stone, snapped twigs. She rose and walked deliberately. She didn't glance back, but they followed. Jacob, then Ben, then others. Through underbrush, over ridges, down dry washes. Finally, in a grove of aspens, they found him. The boy lay curled beneath fallen branches, ankle twisted, face smeared with tears and dirt. Sarah rushed forward. She knelt, examined his leg, smoothed hair from his eyes. Then she looked at Jacob, not proud or triumphant, simply relieved. When the child was safe and the tale recounted, no one called her strange. They called her what she was, the woman who hears with her heart. The wind moved gently that evening, caressing the tall grass, as if it recalled every soul who'd walked this ground. Years had accumulated. The ranch endured, weathered, but wiser, embraced by the steady rhythm of unhurried life. Jacob moved somewhat slower. Sarah's hair showed silver threads, but neither counted years. They measured time in seasons, in moments held softly between joined hands, in the wordless way a heart declares, "I remain." Children came most mornings, from town, from the valley, from homes where words flew too quickly or vanished too easily. Here they discovered something different. They learned to listen not with ears, but with complete attention. They sat with Sarah in the garden while she demonstrated how to distinguish between fear and timidity in a mouse's movement. They stood beside her in the stable, watching her calm horses with only her breathing. The ranch had become more than a home. It had evolved into a haven where silence spoke volumes and understanding transcended words. Sarah's presence had transformed not just Jacob's life, but the very fabric of the community that had once rejected her. Where fear had dwelt, curiosity grew. Where suspicion had festered, respect bloomed slowly, like prairie flowers after rain. They built a life measured in small rituals. Every dawn, Sarah would stand at the eastern window, palms pressed against the glass, reading the day's temperament before the sun fully rose. Jacob would find her there, place a steaming mug in her hands, and they'd share the morning's first moments without need for conversation. She'd write the day's forecast on their slate, and more often than not, she was right. When she wasn't, Jacob would tease her with his eyes, and she'd respond with that rare, precious laugh. Not heard but felt, shaking her shoulders like wind through wheat. The children who came to learn from her grew in number. Parents who'd once clutched their young ones close now brought them willingly, having seen how the Henderson boy could calm any horse after just 3 visits, or how the minister's daughter had developed an uncanny ability to predict rainfall. Sarah taught them patience, perception, and the profound art of listening with more than ears. She showed them how to feel the earth's rhythms, how to sense an animal's mood through its breathing, how to understand without words. One evening, as purple shadows stretched across the wheat fields and evening settled like a blessing, Sarah turned to Jacob on their bench beneath the cottonwood. The years had softened them both. His hands bore more scars from honest work. Her face carried lines from sun and laughter. She had learned to read lips, to shape occasional words, though she still preferred the eloquence of touch and gesture. With careful deliberation, she spoke, her voice unused to sound, soft as moth wings. "I need no words, only you." Jacob's throat tightened. He responded simply, "I hear you. Always have." They remained there until stars emerged one by one like promises kept. The next morning brought new faces. A family traveling west had heard of the woman who could calm their feverish infant when no doctor could help. Sarah tended to the child with her usual grace, brewing herbs, cooling fever with patience and skill. The family departed, grateful, spreading word of the silent healer on the Montana ranch. As seasons cycled, the story of Jacob and Sarah became legend, though they never thought of it that way. They simply lived, day by day, in the profound understanding that had grown between them. When Jacob's arthritis flared, Sarah's hands knew exactly where to press. When memories of her father's cruelty surfaced in Sarah's dreams, Jacob would wake without her stirring, light a candle, and wait until her breathing eased. The final image of their tale found them as they'd always been, together, walking through their land as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sarah's hair had gone fully silver now. Jacob's step had slowed, but their hands remained joined. The mare they'd bought that distant day at market had birthed many foals. The ranch had prospered quietly, and the community that had once feared Sarah now revered her as a treasure. She paused at the hilltop, turned to Jacob, and for only the second time in all their years, she laughed aloud, not a sound of mirth alone, but of complete contentment, of a life fully lived and deeply shared. Jacob smiled, kissed her temple as he had 1,000 times before, understanding that some loves need no words, only the patient devotion of souls who've learned to truly hear each other. Their story lived on in every child who learned to listen with their hands, in every parent who chose understanding over fear, in every moment when silence spoke louder than any shout. Out on those vast Montana plains where wind and quiet share the same tongue, a lonely rancher and a woman the world called deaf had discovered the deepest language of all, the wordless communication of hearts that recognize their match. And in that recognition, they'd found not just love, but home forever.